Hello, everyone. Welcome to Startup Project. I'm your host, Nataraj. My guest today is David Shim. David is a repeat founder, a trader, investor, and before this, he was the CEO of Foursquare. He was at one point the youngest stockbroker in the nation and an angel investor, both as a limited partner in funds and direct investor in startups. Most recently, he founded Read.AI. Their main product is AI meeting summarizer, but they want to be much more and be Copilot for everyone, everywhere. They recently raised $50 million in Series B, led by Smash Capital. In this episode, we'll talk about Read.AI, what is the vision for the company, and David's experience with finding different companies, and his opinions on the current AI hype cycle as well, and a lot more. With that, David, welcome to the show.
No, excited to be here. Appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about Read.
So where are you joining us today from?
I'm in Seattle. So we have an office in Seattle where about 2/3 of the company work and a third are fully remote. And we're in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays in Seattle only. And then Mondays and Fridays, it's optional. And I like to come in. It's just where I like to.
You've worked and created companies, before COVID and after COVID, and you mentioned as, a lot of your team is remote. Do you have a take on, is remote work good, hybrid good? What is your current sense of working or running a company? What is working best for you?
I'd say hybrid is the future. Hybrid is what works. Where I would kind of say hybrid doesn't work as well as if you're really early in your career. It is harder to build those relationships to get that level of mentorship on a fully remote basis. It's not to say that it's impossible, but generally it is a lot more difficult to go in and say like, hey, I saw you next to the water cooler and we talked a couple of times. I didn't even know who you were and I've got to know you a little bit better. And now I know that you're the VP of this or the director of that. And I can go into you and say, hey, you know who I am, David, versus when you're fully remote, especially early in your career, you don't know who to ask. You only have your manager that hired you and then your team, and that's where it kind of ends. So I think that serendipity is missed. This said, once you're more senior, I think it becomes easier and easier for you to be fully where you know what to do, you know who to talk with, you're not afraid to kind of break down walls, you know what needs to get done. And I think that's what comes with a little bit more experience, generally from a rule of thumb. So I think the future is hybrid. I think Read's kind of the same way. We've got third fully remote. And then people come in the office Tuesday, Wednesdays, Thursdays. And then we let people come in on Mondays and Fridays. They don't have to. And what's really happening is people actually like that level of interaction. So they're coming in kind of without being required. But they're like, hey, this is great. I can actually talk to the CEO and I get a little one-on-one time because I want to understand why we're doing X.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think the most important thing is giving the option. I think the optionality is what people like. It's not like they want to completely work from home or they want to completely work from office, but they want the option so that they can work flexibly whenever they want, wherever they want from. Because most statistics say that people are working more when they're working from home, but I think companies like Amazon don't want to agree with that. But I think let's get right into Read.AI. Firstly, great name. I think one single word I think tells you what the product does a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think a great domain name as well. So talk to me a little bit about how did the company start? What was the original idea?
Yeah, original idea was it started when I was in a meeting. So after I'd left Foursquare as CEO, I had a lot of time on my hands. I didn't have a job lined up, was actually debating what I was going to do. And so as part of that, it was still kind of peak COVID. It was on kind of the downslope, but it's still peak COVID. So no one was meeting in person. I'd gone to Mexico like 6 times in like 4 months, and because that was the only place you could go to from the US. And that was getting a little bit boring. And I was doing a lot of these calls where I was either giving advice or someone was going in and saying like, hey, would you want to invest in this company? And what I started to realize was within 2 or 3 minutes of a call, you know if you should be there. Like most of us know, it's like, I should not have been invited to this meeting. Why am I here? But now I turned on my camera. I cannot leave this meeting. It's like sneaking out of a conference room, like people will notice. So usually what most people do when they have that free time is they'll surf the web, right? They'll answer emails, they'll surf the web. They'll do click, 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 click here. They'll look at their phone and see what's going on. Well, what I did that and I was on ESPN, but then I noticed color on the screen that matched the color on my screen. And what it was, I looked a little bit closer, someone was wearing glasses. And on those glasses, I looked at the reflection. And on the reflection, it was the same colors in the image that I could see on ESPN.com that I was on. And so what that did was that triggered like, oh, this is really interesting. Can you use not just audio, but video to understand sentiment and engagement? So can I determine if someone is engaged or not? And it wasn't to go in and do Big Brother and are you working hard? Are you paying attention? But it was actually to go in and say, is it a waste of time? Because anybody in an organization, if you're at Microsoft, if you're at Amazon, well, Amazon's a little bit different, but if you're at Microsoft, you're at Google, any big, large company, you can actually open up an invite 12 people to the meeting, send it out, and probably 12 out of 12 people will accept if they've got an opening on their calendar without too much context, without too much information. Well, now all of a sudden, you've wasted 12 hours of meeting if all those people didn't need to be on. So can you use AI to actually understand, was this a good use of time? And if it wasn't, how can you actually in the future optimize those? And so that's where the idea started to form, where it was saying, hey, can you use this data to optimize productivity? And so I started to dive into the papers, and this was like 2021, and AI hadn't come out as a big thing yet. Like everyone was talking about it, but it wasn't open AI level in 2023. And so I looked at a bunch of the papers, and what I found was computer vision wasn't there yet. What they were used to doing is, hey, we've got someone watching a TV commercial. We're going to track their eyes. We're going to see if they're smiling, but it's a 1-to-1 ratio. It's not in real time. It's very expensive to do. Really need a bunch of hardware. No one was actually applying it to video. And so I started to dive in and say, can you actually apply this to video conferencing? Is the technology there? And is the technology cost effective enough that you could actually run this at scale? So there are two different problems. Like one is you could have the technology, but if it's too expensive to process, you're not going to be able to do it. So the two things that lined up was, yes, it was somewhat expensive, but it wasn't cost prohibitive. And the market was getting cheaper and cheaper for cloud services in terms of processing. And so started saying, okay, it's possible to do. There are models that are open source that have done this before, but they're not really designed for video conferencing. So I started to work with the team of my co-founders and said like, hey, can we actually take the video conferences that we're on, record them, and start to build our own models for sentiment and engagement, and not using just the words that are said, but how do you react to the words that somebody else says? So if you've been on a call, let's say you're OpenAI or you're Anthropic, you get a transcript and someone's salesperson is giving you a pitch. We're great because we will make you 200% more efficient. We'll increase revenue by 500%, and the cost return will be less than 3 months. From a seller's perspective and from a large language model perspective, it sounds like a great call and a great product. But on the flip side, if the client or the prospect is like, they roll their eyes, they start getting more distracted, and they're like, really? Is that right? Like they get frustrated with that. When you pick those things up, the large language models don't pick that up. So you need that reaction layer, that video layer, that responsiveness layer of all the people on the call to understand, is this a good use of? So long way to say it, like there was a bunch of data exhaust from meetings, and the ability to actually process that without just using the words was something that we said was like, this is going to be valuable. And where we started it with was an app on Zoom where we showed you real-time sentiment and engagement.
So were you analyzing video and text at that point of time, or just text?
Video and text, because transcription companies existed then. Like back in 2021, 22, a lot of different transcription companies, as well as the platforms like Zoom, Microsoft had transcription built in. So we were less interested in that, to be upfront, because what I didn't want to build was something that everybody else already had and then try to make it a little bit better. I wanted something that was materially going to step function change the way that people look at transcripts, to change the way that people look at summarization, the way they look at meetings. And so what we did is we said, take the transcripts that exist. We're not going to even release a transcription product, but then go in and apply sentiment and engagement to the transcript. So if you think about it, David said this, but Nataraj responded this way. Well, that narration piece is missing, but the AI that we've built can actually go in and say, this is how the person reacted to the words. So now if you were going to upload something into a large language model, it not only has the quotes that were said, but how individual people reacted. So it could be like the CEO was really skeptical based on his facial expressions, and he started to get disinterested in 15 minutes into the call, and you could very clearly tell that he didn't care about the final end. Like those things that you can't pick up from quotes, but you can pick up from visual cues. The other thing that we started to do was the metadata. So when you and I talk, we have a constant rate of speed that we generally get in the world. So let's say I'm pretty high speed. So let's say I'm like 200 words per minute. But if I go really high and I talk really fast, I go 240 words per minute, and I start going blah, blah, blah. That goes in and says something has changed with David, where the topic he's either really more excited about or he's more nervous about. scripts don't actually have the words per minute. It doesn't have that metadata. When I upload it into OpenAI, it doesn't know what to do with that data. And if I have got a model that says like, oh, David was nervous when he was responding to the question because he went from 200 to 245 words per minute, that's actually valuable. Or we've got a model that goes in and says, hey, based on how many interruptions occur after a certain period of time, you can understand, is there synchrony in the call? I think we've all been on calls where you start talking and they interrupt you and you interrupt them and you both apologize and you just keep apologizing because you can't get into that sync. That actually makes for a pretty bad call at a certain point where it's like, I'm sorry about that. I interrupted you, or you're cutting people off. Most people will get to a point within the first 5 minutes of the call where you stop interrupting each other because you can understand the cadence in which someone speaks. Maybe I have longer pauses in between and you're not going to jump in because you can read that. But again, not available in the large language models. You need to actually go in and understand that from a meta perspective, from a metadata perspective to apply to that.
So what is the value? I guess the product also changed, or might have changed from that initial version to maybe to Series A. What was the discovery there? Like, what's the main value that the customers got and from Read.AI at that?
Yeah. So in 2022, we launched the product that we did the real-time analytics. Calls going well. What are the scores? Both sentiment and engagement. It was great. People really believed it. People went in and said, hey, this is really interesting. I find this valuable. Tell me more about this. Do you have APIs? Can I build on top of? But what was missing from that was the stickiness, because people were like, you're telling me this call's going really bad, but what do I do?
Yeah.
You're not giving me advice. You're telling me what's happening and I believe you and you're giving me early indicators, but I need to solve this problem. So we kind of learned that as we started to interview customers, and we kept on interviewing and we made iterations. We started to do slight recommendations like slow down. Hey, stop interrupting. But again, that was too much cognitive overload. So imagine if someone's never driven a car, or someone's driven a car their whole life, but they never had a dashboard,
Yeah.
like accelerometer, gyroscope, compass, speed, et cetera, all this stuff that are in there, gas, fuel. Well, all of a sudden you put it in front of them, they're going to freak out because they're trying to focus on the road. And now I got to look at this dial, and there's 16 different dials to look at.
Same thing with Google Maps when they all of a sudden give a new feature and you don't know what to do with it.
Exactly. So that's where we went in and said, hey, this is valuable from a data perspective. It's very unique, but our application is not necessarily getting the traction that we hope for. Where else can we apply it? That's when the large language models came out in late 2022 at scale. They existed before, but at scale 2022, we did some testing against that. And we said, hey, I wonder if that narration layer that we have that's pretty unique to us, if we applied it to the text of the conversation, does that create a materially different summary? And the answer was yes. And so we started to go in and say, okay, let's compare it against a prompt without a prompt with our narration layer. And when you started to compare those two things, it was like, oh, this is totally different. Like you could actually see, like, I could tell you this is the most important thing I'm telling you about, but if everyone is not paying attention, that is not the most important thing. So you don't want to put that at the top of the summary. You want to put what everyone is paying attention at the top of the summary. So being able to get that reaction layer really changed the quality of a meeting summary. And it found it more to be human in the sense of it highlighted what was most important to you because you could tell by the reactions, and that created better summary. Where we started 2023 as the number 20 meeting note taker in the world. We just kind of had a little bit of traction. There weren't that many. There was enough, but there weren't that many. Now we're at like, there's probably 100 plus meeting note takers that have some element of AI, but we're now number 2 in the world. So we went from number 20 to number 2 in a period of less than 18 months, and we're within shooting distance of number 1. And I
Who's
think
the number one?
Number 1 is a company called Otter. They've been around for about almost a decade. Really smart folks, but I think it's really highlighting our growth to go in 18 months. We've caught up with someone that's been around for 10 years. It just highlights there's a difference in terms of the approach that we're taking, the methodology that we have, and the quality of it.
And how did you acquire, and in these 18 months, like how did you acquire your customers? Was it inbound? Was it outbound? And did you target a certain segment of customers? Like what was your approach in that sense?
Yeah. So we went in and said, and this is a lot of VCs will say, hey, pick a specific niche, go after that niche and focus in on that. Don't do like wide, go vertical.
Yeah.
And my take and our team's take was this is such a big market where meeting notes right now are really limited to specific niches like sales use cases,
Yeah.
productivity with engineering. I thought this is more mainstream. This is something where it's like, if this is going to be a seminal moment where everyone's going to require an AI assistant over time, this means all the way from an engineer at Google needs it to a teacher to an auto mechanic in small town USA is going to need it to a grocery store owner in Bangalore might need it. And when you look at all of those things combined, we actually see more than a third of our users are now international. We're seeing some of the fastest growth that we've ever seen in emerging markets where they're going in and adopting it. And in a lot of cases, we don't have localized pricing. It might change over time. But you've got countries where it's like Colombia or Ecuador, where our price of our software, which is anywhere from 15 to 45 bucks a month, could be up to 5% of the average income in a country on a monthly basis for someone to use, but they're buying it. And so that's where they're finding use cases where it's like, I'm going to cut 5% of my paycheck for this software solution because it's giving me so much ROI. So I think from a standpoint of market, we went horizontal versus vertical. That has actually helped out a lot from a PLG motion, where we're adding about, over 25 to 30,000, depending on the day, net new users every single day without spending a dollar on me. So we don't spend, it's just pure word of mouth, pure product-led growth, where if you see the product, people will use the product, they will talk about the product, they will share the product. And that's been kind of a wheel that's been really accelerating more and more as we went through 2023.
Is it because you're landing, if you're not spending anything on marketing, is it because you're landing on someone on a meeting with one person and two other people see it and it's being useful and then they buy it? Is that because the product inherently has that aspect, right? I think if you are taking notes on this meeting and I'm not a Read.AI as user, but I can see that transcript or summary being generated, and that gives me an exposure to the product if it is good or bad. Is that the reason, like how the word of mouth is spreading?
100%. And so meetings are natively multiplayer. You can't have a virtual meeting without more than one person, right? So you got two people on a call. Everybody on the call is talking. So if someone writes notes, no one's offended. Oh, you're writing notes. This is horrible. Like everyone's on the call. You could write your own notes if you want to. And so that level of kind of use cases already exists. And then the problem that typically happens, like who's writing the notes, who's going to send it out, who's going to draft it up. Like that was the early 2020 problem with video conferencing. The problem today now is like, hey, how do I get access to those reports? And what we've done is we've actually made it really simple for the owner, whoever invited Read, to go in and share it just by typing in an email address, send it to them, push it to Jira or Confluence as a page, push it to Notion. And so we're not trying to be like everyone needs to be on our platform and consume all the data here. This is where Copilot Go Everywhere kind of comes into place. We want to push it wherever you work. You don't need to necessarily come to Read.AI. You can never come to Read.ai, but you will see the data on a Confluence page. You'll see it on a Notion page. You'll see a Jira ticket updated with action items. You'll see a Salesforce opportunity that has better notes than the seller has ever done. You're like, what's going on? Oh, it's bottom. It says, oh, generated by Read. And you're like, oh, okay, what is this thing? So it's that value proposition from a bottoms up motion that has really driven a lot of our growth and adoption, where people are going in and saying, you are solving a very clear problem for me. And the second layer of growth I would say that we've seen traction on is the additional products. So if you think about the meeting notes category as a whole, it's large. It's probably got a couple hundred players now at this point. What you find with the meeting notes is a lot of them are very similar. There's not a difference. And it's like, hey, some of them don't even look across multiple meetings. Read by default actually processes across multiple meetings. And what that means is we can give you context. Your first meeting on a topic versus your 10th meeting on a topic. Read doesn't treat those as silos, but it aggregates all of those together with a product called For You and Readouts. And it gives you a status report. It says, how is this progress? How's this topic progressing? That's very hard to do in a lot of cases because you might get wrong information. But people are like, oh, this is great. Like I can actually send to my manager what I've been working on, not just one meeting report, but a whole update on topics. 3 months ago, we introduced readouts that include emails, that include Slack messages, Teams messages. So now all of a sudden, it's Copilot everywhere. It's not Copilot for your meeting. And when you have Copilot everywhere, the adoption becomes like, oh, this is freaking great. I don't have to go log into Gmail. I don't have to go into Salesforce for a CRM. I don't have to go to Zoom. I don't have to use all these other solutions. It's just right there. And then I can decide where I want to push it.
Yeah. I mean, I can almost see when you put this everywhere, because I think when I first used note takers, and one of the note takers was actually on the podcast like a couple of years back, which was Fathom. I don't know if you've heard of them. He's also a repeat entrepreneur, and they raised, I think, Series A. And the question I really had is, if you just generate notes, I think it was not useful for me, at least. And then once like AI sort of came into mainstream, one of my visions that I saw is there will be a product that is in your workplace, knows all the work that you're doing. And there should be a single place where you chat with it and it tells you like, these are the tasks that you're working on and these are the progress that you're making. And you can focus on each task and ask questions or get knowledge about those tasks or get meeting notes about it. So you can almost see an ever-present Copilot on a work setting, especially, that will really change productivity for knowledge workers. And we are seeing that sort of different angles of approaches to get there. And, Microsoft has Copilot to do that. And you're coming at in a different abstraction layer, saying that we're coming from a meeting notes perspective, but we'll be everywhere and collect all that knowledge because this knowledge is an important building part of that. Is that the vision where you're going, where, this sort of becomes like a Copilot in that sense, or are you thinking something different?
No, that's exactly what we're thinking from a Copilot everywhere perspective. When you think about like the current state of meetings, it's about pushing it to different platforms. We do that today, but you also need to have when you pull the data down, you have a totally different challenge because there aren't LLMs to go and say, here's 16 disparate data sources, combine them together, that then you can run an LLM. So you have to build these models to identify topics. Is this topic like, hey, how's your day going versus this day is the lowest revenue that we've had, or this is the best day that we've ever had? Like there's all this different context that you need to be able to solve for that the large language models don't do, that are more specific NLP models. You're doing topics, you're doing clustering. And when you're able to do that correctly, it becomes magic. And all of a sudden it becomes this productivity tool where it's like, hey, I don't need to think about X, Y, and Z. It really becomes like almost a TikTok feed where here are the topics that are relevant to you, David, because this is what you've been working on. This is what you've been interested. Let's say I'm a CRO. I really want to know how revenue is going. Well, now I get a feed of all the deals that are about to close. I get updates on, is this a good likely to close? This is not likely to close. And that becomes high value. I think from a ROI perspective, it's huge.
You mentioned the vertical versus horizontal approach. Are you still like thinking breadth first and like, thinking about features that you should launch that will help across the breadth? Or are you now targeting what does a Fortune 500 company want? Or, what does a SMB want? Or what does a sales company want? How are you thinking about that horizontal and vertical approach now?
Yeah, so we're still horizontal, but we're picking specific verticals based on customer demand. So sales, engineering, product management, recruiting, those are very clear kind of indications from our teams where we've heard they want X, Y, and Z. That's why we did the Notion integration, which is one of the fastest growing we've ever launched. That's why we did Jira and Confluence. That's why we're doing more and more additions from there, like Slack. And someone said like, hey, I'd love Slack messages because Slack is actually almost like Snapchat for messaging. For corporate messaging, because it doesn't disappear, but I get so many Slacks. If I click on something and I forget about it, I come back, it's buried under another like 3 different scrolls of actually finding the content that was relevant to me. So I need something that goes in and says, David was interested in this topic in the meetings that he was in the emails that he had. Now go find that in the Slack messages and the Slack channels that I can't read. And if you deliver that to me, that becomes infinitely valuable. So that's where it's that Copilot everywhere. And what you're hearing about Copilot everywhere is another way to look at it is it's agents. Everyone's talking about AI agents right now. I'd say that's the hot thing in the AI space is, hey, everyone's doing this agent. Agents can talk with each other. Well, in reality, that's nice. But what you want is you want your Jira to talk with your Notion, to talk with your Microsoft, to talk with your Google, and talk with your Zoom.
Yeah.
You can call it whatever you want, but those are the integrations where they can talk with one another, where it's push and pull of data. And I think that is going to be the next big space where you'll see agents come into play, but people won't even know it's an agent. It's a click button that I did single sign on and that I added that permission.
In terms of models, what are the models that you're, primarily foundation models that you're using? And talk to me a little bit of like pricing, because some of the like very, very early stage products that I see are completely priced based on how the foundation model is pricing. So how are you thinking about like pricing, and are you optimizing it for price, or are you still, sort of held in control of foundation model?
We are not held in control of foundation models. To give you an idea, last month, 90% of our processing was our own proprietary. So what we use the large language models is for the last month. It's going in and saying, hey, we found 16 really interesting topics. Here are the response scores. Here are the reactions. Can you put this into a readable sentence? Can you put this into a readable paragraph? But we're actually using the reactions of how people interact. We're looking at the metadata like, hey, when you reply to an email, your average time is 30 minutes. But when you reply to someone in 2 minutes and you've done it 6 different times across a week, that's all of a sudden high priority, very important person or very important topic. So we're building these models that cluster these groups together, that then we're going in and identifying the subject matter that's being discussed. Then we're going to the LLMs and saying, hey, just summarize this for us, but we've identified all the key pieces. So for us, 90% of our processing cost is our own internal models. I think we're at like 5 issued patents now, and we've got more pending. So I think this is where we're different from a lot of companies. We actually have this in place versus we're building a wrapper layer where it's like, hey, we got really good prompts, but like that only gets you till 4.5 comes out or 5 comes out, and they got to
Yeah.
rewrite all your prompts. It's like, that's not a defensible mode. That's a temporary.
So in a way, and I'm assuming these models are mostly NLP models and not LLMs, and are like focused on getting a better sort of view from the transcripts that you're generating.
That's on the words, but on the computer vision side of things, to react like you're nodding your head like this, we've got models to detect that. We've got models where if you're looking like this and I'm talking to you, but I'm going to a fixed point, what that means is my camera is potentially there, and then I go back to the main big monitor that I have here. So when you move your head, if you go to fixed points, there's a separate model for that. So when you start to stack all of these models up, it starts to give you, hey, accuracy goes from 0.75 to 0.8, to 0.9 to 1. Those are the models that you've got to stack together. It's not just, what we've learned is one model will not solve all the issues that are required to really deliver relevant.
So you're almost using the best of sort of pre-LLM era and post-LLM era, and you're taking the models that you want for your specific feature that you're building and using LLMs only when required.
Yes. And LLMs are great, but so we don't have to worry about that. That's going in and saying, you've got like 4 or 5 companies of massive scale that have billions of dollars that are going to continue to improve that piece. Go for it all day long. But when you're talking about computer vision, a lot of it's more like, hey, what are the words in front of me? Like, what is the object in front of me? We're going in and saying, like, take it a step further. Is that object happy or sad, in the sense of like, are they nodding their head? Or are they shaking their head? Are they actually engaged where they're looking straight ahead? Or are their eyes going kind of like this and looking around? Those are all things that you pick up. And then it's also going in and saying, what's the interaction between the two objects? So if you have 2 people, if you have 2 emails, if you have a Slack message that goes back and forth, what are the response times? How deep are you going? How unique is the content that you're generating? All of those things are really metadata points. And I think the best example is for anyone who's used TikTok or Reels, within about 5 minutes with a fresh account, it can figure out with a very high level of accuracy what content you're interested in, and it starts to build on top of that. And you don't even need to like an individual story. It pulls in the weak signal that says, hey, you normally watch a story for 10 seconds. This one you watch for 30 seconds. You're more interested in this content. Let's figure out what else is here. And I think that's where that's what a lot of large language models honestly do, is like, it's going in and finding these patterns, but we're applying it to non-text-based solutions. So we're applying it to the computer vision.
Got it. In the LLM space, what is your take on which model is doing better versus which model is doing what? Like, in that sense, what is your take? Like, which models are doing better?
I think it depends on what you ask me, honestly, because they're always releasing new versions of the models. You've got 4.0 versus 4.0 mini. You've got Anthropic Claude, was it 3.5 now? Like, I would go in and say, generally, they're starting to become less and less step functions up and more, hey, I've got another 5-10% increase. It's for a specific use case. It's better. The reasoning is good, but you don't necessarily need that. It's it's starting to get more vertical now and saying, hey, reasoning is good for math problems. So for math problems, there's a new model that does reasoning. I suspect that over time, the models will even start to plateau a little bit more. It'll take longer and longer to get releases because they're not materially different from the previous one, where you or I wouldn't know. Sure, a data scientist that puts up 10,000 different variations, and we'll be testing all those 10,000 variations. But for a normal person, they're going to be like, I don't know the difference against this if you train it against 10 billion versus 10 trillion.
How are you as a company is using AI, like as in terms of your own operations? Like, are you using AI for code writing, or are you using AI for your own purposes? And like, you're a startup, you are a company. Are you spending on AI to be a better company or like have more productivity out of your company?
Oh yeah. So we test out all the AI features that come in through all the platforms. Some of them are honestly a lot of hype. Some of them are like, interesting, but not directly applicable from a pricing perspective. I don't want to call anybody out in a bad way. One of the use cases that is very clear is on the marketing side, specifically on the video side for dubbing. What's happened in the last year and a half around dubbing is becoming incredibly, it's really going to be game changing for that industry. So by dubbing, for the people that don't know, what it used to be is like, hey, I'm talking right now. I'd either have to hire a Spanish speaker to say the same things that I said, Korean speaker, whatever that is, native language speaker to say what I said and dub it over. And they try to match my lips. Or we just have a totally different video call with the Spanish language speaker. Now the AI can go in and say, hey, within like 5 to 10 minutes of uploading a file, take David's voice and then transform it into a Spanish language speaker, but use the same tone that he has, the same prosody that he has. So it sounds like David is speaking Spanish as a native speaker, and then also match his lips in the same rate of speed that it's going, or using AI, adjust it slowly. And you're seeing it now to the point that YouTube has rolled out a feature where if you upload a video, I don't think it's fully out there, but they've got it for certain creators, you can start to just automatically dub every single video that you have across like 7 or 8 languages. And I think that is game changing for a lot of different organizations, because what used to be a problem, if you're like, hey, I think Brazil is a great market for Read, it's actually really big, but we would have never been able to get there without AI, because now we're able to create video on YouTube. That's one of our most popular videos that's in Portuguese, that's dubbed of me and the team talking, and it's in native Brazilian Portuguese, which is awesome. And now we've got customers coming in and saying like, hey, what's going on? And we've got Brazilian Portuguese on our website. We've got it on our applications. All those things combined would not have been possible 3 years ago.
Yeah. I think Mr. Beast used to have a whole team to translate his videos into, because like he had one of the most popular Hindi channels, for example, and he was just dubbing his all content from English to Hindi, and same in Mexico, so into Spanish. And he can now probably use that one feature instead of having 20 people employed on this purpose, right? So yeah, I can see that. What about code writing and code generation? Have you guys actually using GitHub Copilot or Cursor or some of those things?
We're testing it off and on. Like some people like to use it. I would go in and say it's helpful for the earlier career engineers than it is latent. Like we're seeing like early career engineers, it's good to have, it's almost like there's less of it going on than it used to be like 10, 15 years ago, but like pair coding, it's like having someone that's watching over your shoulder that you're putting together with. I would say for the more senior engineers, they use it, but they're more likely to be the ones that don't turn it on because they don't find value in it over the long term. But it is helpful. It is, again, different use cases for different folks. And I think AI doesn't need to be one size fits all for every single job function.
Yeah.
And certain people use it more than others.
So what do you think about the whole trend of agents, and like, are we seeing any real sort of use cases?
I think it's early. And the reason why I think it's early is it's the same way with voice. I think voice is really interesting, but if I was going to use an example like Alexa, massive early scale on, and then it kind of dropped off. If you look at Siri, the same thing happened here. And I think a lot of folks are going in and saying voice is the next play on AI. I think it's an important play, but I don't think it's going to be the thing that brings everything together. It's going to be just a feature as part of a larger kind of bucket of features to make a product. And I think with agents is the same thing. A lot of people are talking about it, but in reality, it's not that simple to go in and say, hey, go search for flights and find me the best flight that has this. Because you also need to know what to ask for. It's not going in and saying, find me the best flight. It's done. It's like, hey, what dates do you want, David? Hey, are you using miles? Are you going to use a credit card? Hey, this is at 2 a.m. Do you want to fly out at 2 a.m.? Hey, the layover is 16 hours. Like all of those things where an agent in theory could go out and find those and then talk with somebody else's agent could happen, but you still need to upload the data. It's just like with any model that you build from a data science or engineering perspective, you need training data. And if you're going to build agents as a consumer, what's your training data? Like that's still a little bit of waste. And like you see companies come out with like, hey, we can screenshot your videos and we'll capture what you're doing on your computer. But what if I click something else? Or if I go to a different part, like, is it going to transform it correctly? Oh no. We've tested some things. It's interesting, but is it mainstream? Not yet. It could be very in a year or two. But I think the agents in the background are the things that are going to be more likely. Where it's agents where someone has gone in and said, I've translated, I've got training data on how to handle these use cases. What are the different fields that are available? And this agent can then talk with somebody else who has an agent on their side and work with one another to get the job done. And I very much think that is a thing, but I think for the consumer, they're not going to know what agent is, just like most consumers don't know what agent is.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of coin all this into one word is all AI is draft AI. Like it gets into like 80% draft. Like all these agents will get you like 80%, 70% draft stage, but you can never like trust it to take it to the final version of it. Like searching flights, okay, it will give you maybe top 5 options, but it will not give the one that you really want. Same thing with marketing content. It will give you maybe 90% of it, but the 10% requires your, human in the loop. So I think we're still seeing that there's a 20, 30% gap in terms of all these use cases that you get to the draft stage, but not to the final stage. Agents, the same thing. Most of the tooling, it's the same thing, but that is still valuable. It's not to say that it's valuable, but we might take time to get to the 100%. Coming back to Read.AI, what is the vision like from here on next couple of years? What do you think Read.AI will look like in next, 3-4 years?
Yeah, I would say next 1 to 2 years, it's diving in further around the Copilot everywhere. So we're adding more and more integrations as we go, and these are all native integrations. These are not integrations where it's Zapier or webhooks. Like those are nice too, don't get me wrong, but native integrations where it's both push and pull. So it's about pushing our data that we have for meetings, the summaries that we have, and then eventually more data like optimization. So where we want to get to, and we will get to in very short order, is going to be, I've got your emails, I've got your messages, I've got your meetings. Let's say you're a seller. As you have each call or email with a client, I can start to go in and say, in Salesforce, that probability goes from 25 to 50, it goes from 50 to 75%. And so just like you had said, then we can push a draft to them to say, hey, we think this opportunity should go to 75%. Here's the quote in the meeting where it says, John says, hey, I think we're ready to move forward with a proposal for pricing. Yeah. Can you send that over? And it's like, and we think it's going to be about $100,000. Great. That's all on the Salesforce ticket. You hit it. You say, do I agree? Yep. Maybe you make a slight edit. You submit it. And now what was typically the most hated function for a seller to go in every single day and update Salesforce. Yeah. Now it's just an automated process where it's almost like TikTok or Tinder where you're like, yep, this is right, swipe right, swipe left. This is wrong. I want to edit this to say something else. I think that's that level of optimization. People don't talk enough about in AI, where people talk about, hey, here's content. We're giving you content. We're giving you content. But once you have the content, what's the next action? It's changing that optimization. Like, how do you make your day better? How do you make your updates more clearer, more frequent? And that level of optimization is what people are going to ask for. Even with a Jira ticket, to give you an idea, most organizations, when they have Jira, they have hundreds of tickets. And you might be a product manager on a call, and you missed that call where some engineer was talking with another engineer, and they said, hey, we just finished that. That's all done. It might take you a week to figure out, is this done or not? But if that engineer shared that report with you, and it says that's done, we can go in and say, hey, this is important. There's an associated Jira ticket. Let's go update that, and let's connect the dots from Zoom to Jira and update. And all of a sudden now it's like, project manager did their job at more scale, that they can focus more on project managing, so they can focus less on project managing and more focus on deep. So I think that's the stuff where, to your point, it's the draft level, but it's getting it to that 80 to 90%, but it's giving you the drafts that you didn't even know you needed. Yeah. Where it's like, okay, I can solve this problem. Another really good example that we're actually seeing use cases today on is a lot of teams are distributed hybrid, especially in the marketing industry, where you've got account managers to account directors to VPs in different areas. And sometimes they don't see each other for weeks in person, but they're all talking digitally. Well, if an account manager talks with a VP that's a client and has a really bad call, you have to hope that the account manager actually bubbles that up to say, hey, this wasn't a great call. I need to figure out what to do next. Like, help me out here. They might be like, hey, there's no one around. Like, I might just let this go and hopefully it's going to be okay. But if I'm the VP, I want to be like, that's our biggest client. I don't want to put blame on the individual, but I want to proactively work with that person to say, hey, I don't think this was the best approach. Look, this is how the AI said they didn't react very well. And it went from a 75% close to 50% close. Let's go figure out what we need to do next. And that's where the AI can not only notify, but say like, hey, here are 4 things that might work based on your organization structure and based on what we've learned from an organization that could turn this thing around. And then you decide that last 10% where it's the human in the loop, where it's like, out of those 4, these 3 won't work for this client, but I think this one is a really good one. Let's go after it.
I want to slightly shift gears and talk about your investing. You've invested in different funds, you've invested in SPVs and direct investments. What's your general thesis on what you want to invest in?
So on the venture side of funding, I would go and say, if you believe in me to invest in me as a company, I should have the same thesis to invest in the VC, because I like to think smart people invested in Read, smart people invested in Place, smart people invested in Foursquare. So with those companies, if I believe that, and this is founders don't do this enough, if you believe that they are really smart people, then you should want to invest in their funds. And if you want to invest in their funds, a lot of times they're closed to outside investors because they've got more money than they can do anything. But if you're an investor, if you're a portfolio company, they're like, well, yeah, we can let
Yeah, they
you.
might give access. Yeah.
Yeah, they'll give you access for a lower amount too. And I think every founder should be taking advantage of that, because it opens up more diversity where, hey, you might be investing in your own company, which you should be doing anyways, but it's going to be like 2% of your portfolio that you eventually, it doesn't really matter. There's no overlap, but you are able to get that venture. So I think that's one. I think two is on the venture funds. I'm actually scaling a little bit back now because I had too many funds. It almost became an index fund than it was a individual kind of stock picking approach.
If you diversify too much, then you become an index.
Yeah. And then it's like, okay, this is startup tech. That's great. It's a good space to be most of the time, but it's also not kind of getting the outsized returns for some of those funds. So that's one. When I do the angel investing, it's one of two things. One is anyone that I know that asked me to invest that I've worked with them before, they've worked for me. Generally, you're more likely to get a yes from me, because it's more like, you believed in me when we were building this out. I believe in you that you can make this work. And if it doesn't, that's fine. But I want to give you that same level of trust back. And so I've done that a number of times. Some have worked out really well. Some haven't, but it's not that big of a deal because that's like startup investment. The second is when it comes to kind of like more interesting opportunities that come up on my radar where I'm reading a paper or I'm on a trade and it's interesting, I might reach out. And I've been a little bit lucky because I not even place that we sold to Snapchat. That was really nice. But like just being CEO of Foursquare, if I say that, people are like, oh, are you interested in investing? It's like, yeah, let me put a little bit of check in there. They're more open to having that brand name on there, just on their cap table. So that's been good as well. So I would go in and say those are kind of the two approaches that I take, both from a venture standpoint and an individual.
Are there any companies that really played out well in the ones that you actually went and reached out?
A couple of them have. A couple of them have rejected me too. Like I can tell you, a couple of them rejected me where they tried to hire me. This is before I read, but they're like, hey, you're a free agent. You can't invest, but do you want to come in as COO or do you want to? I was like, nope, not interested, but appreciate, very flattered. But take my check and I can give you advice. But generally, I would say like it's been about 50-50. So it hasn't been bad at all in terms of getting those investments on board. And generally those have paid off because it's something where it's like, I found that they have something novel and interesting that has caught my eye that I think could really kind of do outsized return to that.
And you're also an investor in A16Z, Tiger Global, Kato. These are names hard to get into. Is this all because you were also a founder these funds invested in, or how did you get into these funds? Because it's hard for individuals usually to get into these funds, right?
Yeah. So Andreessen Horowitz, that was kind of, I was CEO of Foursquare. Andreessen Horowitz was an early investor in Foursquare. I got to know Ben while I was CEO when he was on the board. So we had a relationship built there. And I asked the question, hey, do you have like a fund that I can invest in? It's like, well, let me put you on a list. And sometimes when they say put you on the list, that means like, maybe not. Ben really came through and he's like, yeah, we got this thing open. Here's the details. You want to come on board and do that. So I think it's those types of relationships that are in place that you kind of have to not leverage in a bad way because you're actually trying to give them money. So it's not like, hey, you give me money, I'm going to use the relationship, but it's more getting that slot that's available, that allocation.
It's also like you vetted both sides. Like both sides have vetted each other at that point, so they know what they're getting into. So it's either a yes or no, pretty much, right? Because they know you and you know them, so you know what you're getting into on both sides.
Exactly. And you're also a resource for them. So if I could tell you in the funds that I've invested in where I'm an LP, they'll come in and sometimes say like, hey, David, we're looking at something in location, or we're looking at something in mobile, or we're looking at something in analytics. Can you take a look at it? Can you talk to the CEO real quick and give me a POV? I've done that a few times and I love doing that for them. It's also interesting for me to understand what the latest technology is. So it's a reciprocal relationship. So they like to have folks like that on the cap.
Yeah. I mean, you had a whole early career on trading, and I think you mentioned in one of your conversations, like you're the youngest stockbroker in the country. Talk to me a little bit about that experience.
So what was it? I was day trade. This will date me, but this was like early internet, like Prodigy, CompuServe, AOL.com, where it's the dial-up internet. And there was a broker called eBroker.com. So electronic broker is just a website. You log in, you type in a ticker symbol, the number of shares, you pull a quote up. And I'd built a little macro that would just refresh the quote over and over. So it's almost real-time quotes that I was pulling through. It was delayed, but it was like still real-time back then. And then I would start to put orders in. And what would happen is I would throw in like 30, 40, 50 orders in an hour. And their systems weren't, this is the old days. It wasn't set up to handle that much volume. It was more like, hey, I want to buy 100 shares of Microsoft. Fill it sometime today. I was like, fill this now at this price, or I'm going to cancel it. And then I'll put a new order in. I'm going to cancel it. And so they actually banned me as a customer. They said, hey, take your money out. We're going to cut you a check for your account. I was like, sure, try to give you money. Then I started to look into like, okay, if I want to do this at a higher rate, what's available? And there was a concept called small order execution system. And that was introduced during Black Friday where people can sell their stock. So if you're selling less than 1,000 shares, the stock market, the market makers back then would have to decide if they're going to buy it or move off their price within 30 seconds. So if I said I want to buy Microsoft at $100, you have to either take my order within 30 seconds or you have to go to $101. You have to move off of that price. And so that was actually really cool. That gave me kind of the small investor access. Then I got a T1 line, and this was when T1 lines weren't normal. And I started to get level 2 quotes, and I started trading stocks back and forth. And I was doing huge amounts of volume because when you buy 1,000 shares and you can get a 25-cent swing, that's $250. If you can do that 10 to 20 times a day, you're making 2,500 grand a day. And this is when I was 16 years old, 17 years old. That was a lot of money. So I did that and I started trading that way. And then I was doing so much volume. They came back to me and said like, hey, wait, how old are you again? I was like, yeah, I'm 17 now. And they're like, whoa. This isn't legal. You have to be 18 to actually trade stocks because you're signing a contract and you can reverse these trades because you're not an adult. So I had to go. So I was like, oh man, this sucks. And this is where the entrepreneur comes into me, where it's like, this sucks. And they're not letting me trade. And I said like, what could I do? And they're like, nothing. You can't do anything. Well, what's preventing me from doing this? Well, your contract is not legally binding. I said, well, what if I was emancipating from my parents? Then my signature is legally binding. And for people who don't know, emancipation is where you go to court and you say, hey, I'm technically an adult that I can do my own contracts. And so I was like, what if I get emancipated? Like they talk to their legal and they're like, yeah, that's still risky because you can be emancipated, but you don't know anything about stocks. Look at my trading. I'm doing well. Like, doesn't matter. It's like, what else could I do? And they said, hey, well, you could become a broker if you wanted to. And I was like, okay. I was like, what do I have to do? So I had to take the Series 7, 24, 63, and 65. These are all like stockbroker licenses. I went to the library, 2 months to start reading the books on my own. And I realized like when you take the test, anyone could do it. You just go, it's like, you just sign up, you figure out what you're doing, you go take the test. And I took the test and I passed them. So I became the youngest licensed stockbroker in the nation when I was 17. That might have changed. I was like 20 years or 30 years ago almost, yeah. But that got me into the door where I was like, okay, now I could trade stocks. I was 17 years old. I was a broker. And the advantage there, honestly, was I wasn't the smartest. I wasn't an algorithmic guy. It was just pattern recognition to go in and say, this pattern will make you money. And this was before computers existed that did the algos, that did the high frequency, and everything was manual. So I did really well for about 3 years doing that. And then ultimately I pulled back because everyone started to get broadband. And as the internet got faster, people would see the same quotes that I did. The technology opened up a bit more. So my advantage became smaller and smaller and smaller, where at a certain point I was just grinding it out too much, where I was like, okay, either I can go all in on this or I can move off and do something else. And my moving off and doing something else was go to college.
Yeah. I mean, the alpha is gone at that point.
Pretty much, yeah. 100% it's gone. Like if you asked me to do it now, I would do very poorly.
So, I mean, we're almost at the end of our conversation. I want to ask a couple of quick questions that we ask all our guests at the end. What are you consuming right now? Either books, podcasts, Netflix, could be anything. What are you consuming right now?
Yeah, podcasts. I've been more and more just kind of walking into work. I like My First Million. If you've ever listened to that, it sounds a little bit buzzy and a little bit scammy, but it really is two founders. They're on a call talking about different ideas. They get different people on the call, and it's just more about like, how do you ideate? How do you decide what works? Who's making things successful and bringing those people in, just learning from them? I really like that from a podcast perspective. From a content perspective, I try to consume as much content as I can from a news feed perspective. And I don't mean that from a TikTok or a Reels, but like in my industry in AI, there's so many different trades out there. And you have to go in and understand what are the things that are like not just mainstream, but what are up and coming. And that does require you to spend some time researching. And then as you identify those things, like going in and saying like, hey, does this apply to me? Yeah, it could apply to me. Let me dive into the docs. Let me see what the docs and the specs is something we should work on. Those are things that I'm really focusing on. It's like anything that is interesting to the Copilot everywhere concept, the optimization concept that exists out there. And then from a TV perspective, like I like to watch the most brain dead things that are possible. Like TV is where I just zone out. So it's watching those, what do you call those? Those Survivor type, My 90-Day Fiance, all those weird shows that are out there. Because you can just zone out and not think about anything. But there's a limit. There's definitely a limit on that.
Who are the people or mentors that helped you in your career?
Everyone will say parents. I would totally agree with that. My parents were first generation, came from Korea, college educated. I took jobs that, looking back at it would be like a step down for them. But what they did was they really figured out, hey, it might be a step down, but we're going to make this work and we're going to make this scale out. And that just highlighted to me that if you put enough effort into anything, you could figure a way out of it and you can actually excel at it. Not just figure out a way out, but you can excel at it. I think that was something that really was ingrained in my DNA early on in my life. I'd say, and I know you know him as well, Matt McElwain has been a great mentor of mine. Where I first met him was a company called Faircast, where we did airfare price predictions. I was like employee 20, nothing senior, but I got to know him there. He invested in my first startup, Place Location Analytics. Then moving to Foursquare, he's a great advisor there. And now he was the first dollar in when we started Read. So I think like he's been kind of along the way. He's seen me grow. I've seen him grow, and he's been able to give me a lot of insight and help me stop making some mistakes. And other times, like, let me make the mistakes so I can learn on my own. I think that's a big part of a mentor is like, I'm going to tell you, but it might actually be good if you actually make this mistake yourself and understand what that meant. What my advice meant in terms of, hey, you got to watch out for this next time around. And you're like, it's better to actually make that mistake sometimes.
What do you know about being a founder or investor that you wish you knew when you're starting in your career?
I would say at Placed, I was a solo co-founder, and that is very expensive on your time, your stress level, your relationships, etc. Because when you're a solo founder, you have nobody else to go to. Nobody understands your pain within the organization because you own the biggest chunk of the company in most cases. And so like, hey, boo-hoo, you're doing really well. It's really hard. Nobody cares. So I think it's very difficult. And I would go in and say, don't force it. If you could do it on your own, sure. But if you can find co-founders that you trust, that you work with really well, that's with Elliot and Rob Williams on my team here. They've been incredible co-founders where it distributes out the work, it distributes out the stress, but it also distributes out the knowledge where people can work on the same problem. And when you come back together, you have three really smart people that come back with different ideas and different approaches, and then you're able to ideate. So I would go in and say, for any founders out there, definitely make sure if the opportunity exists, go co-founder versus solo. From an investor standpoint, I would go in and say, outside of your own startup, don't over-index on anything. Like whatever is hot will stay hot for a little bit, but it'll drop off almost always. Like individual stocks, over allocations on different things. Hey, hot new startup, if you were in 2021 or 22 and someone said like, hey, come into this, it's the next unicorn, and you put money into it, you're probably underwater at this point. You may never even see your money. So I think be careful about over-indexing on anything. And this is something I wish I did earlier. Just put it in the index fund a lot. If this is not your core job, is not to trade, like put it in an index fund. Index fund, like S&P 500 is up 25%. Like that's better than any VC IRR in general on a yearly basis. So, and it's liquid. So I think, yes, you might get more outsized returns, but 25% is really nice to get in a single year.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Thanks for coming on the show. This was a fascinating conversation, and thanks for sharing all about Read.AI.
Excellent. No, really appreciate the time. This is a lot of fun.